A sitting point us congresswoman, a Supreme Court justice, a federal courtroom turned battleground, and the trigger? A 3-year-old tweet and a voice that refused to be silenced. On a gray Monday morning in Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett received an envelope thick, gold, sealed, and colder than the marble it slid across. At first, she thought it was ceremonial, maybe a policy invitation or another ethics panel. But as she flipped the pages, her pulse dropped. It was a subpoena, not from a committee, not from an oversight office. It came from a federal courtroom, and the name at the bottom wasn't just any judge. It was Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a Supreme Court justice, sitting, presiding over an open federal hearing involving a member of Congress. That was more than unprecedented. It was almost unbelievable. Crockett blinked, reread the name, and then again. The logic didn't compute because this wasn't procedure. This was something else, a setup. Jasmine Crockett wasn't new to pressure. She had faced down cameras, hostile committees, national media traps. But this felt like the system itself reaching into her chest and daring her to breathe. It wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a warning shot. They're reaching, her legal advisor said over the phone that night. A former federal prosecutor, calm under fire. It's not illegal, but it's meant to be loud. It's optics. They're putting Barrett on this to send a message. You're the message. I'm not backing down, Jasmine replied. They're going to hear me. I don't care who's wearing the robe. 3 days later, she landed in D.C., walked through a crowd of reporters, flashbulbs, and security gates, dressed sharp. Navy blue pantsuit, no apology in her stride. Her curls framed her jaw like armor. Inside the courtroom, the air was frozen. Not in temperature, but in tone. The ceiling loomed. Marble walls absorbed whispers like secrets. Crockett took her place at the witness table, flanked by her legal team. She looked forward. Then the doors opened. Barrett entered, black robe, expression carved in stone, their eyes locked. Not long, just enough for Jasmine to see it. Recognition, maybe even challenge. We are here today to gather testimony relevant to case No. 24, FR 2025, Barrett began, her voice clipped impersonal. This is a federal proceeding. Any disruption, defiance, or deviation from protocol will not be tolerated. Jasmine didn't flinch. The hearing started with formality, but the questions veered fast into politics, tweets, public commentary, everything but the issue she was called to testify on. This has nothing to do with the case, Jasmine finally said, eyes locked on her interrogator. I was called to testify on oversight, not on my politics. Barrett didn't let her finish. The witness will not speak out of turn. With all due respect, Jasmine replied, leaning in, I will not be used as a political punching bag in a courtroom. If there is a charge, name it. If not, let's stop pretending this is justice. The room fell into silence. Not the kind that waits for answers. The kind that holds its breath. Let the record show the witness has been warned, Barrett said tightly. But Crockett wasn't just speaking to the bench. She knew the cameras were still rolling. The country was watching. Her voice was no longer just her own. Outside, social media ignited. A 30-second clip of Jasmine confronting the Supreme Court justice exploded online. No filters, no edits, just fire. By the next morning, the hashtag let her speak had crossed 1 million views. People weren't just watching. They were choosing sides. By day 2, the courtroom felt more like a powder keg. The air was tenser. The prosecutors moved faster. They brought up speeches Crockett had made, protests she attended, even social media likes from 3 years ago. You seriously brought up something I liked online before this hearing existed? Jasmine said, stunned. The post speaks to your state of mind, the prosecutor replied. Your bias against the court. I'm not on trial, Jasmine said firmly. But if I were, you'd be failing to prove anything. Barrett's voice cut through like a blade. Congresswoman Crockett, this is your final warning. Jasmine's response was calm, measured, deadly. Disrupt or respond? Because those aren't the same thing and you know it. The room shifted. Quiet gasps, shuffling seats. A bailiff gave a look toward the gallery, like even he didn't know what would come next. Barrett raised her gavel, paused, reconsidered. Please proceed, she told the prosecutor, ice running through her tone. But everyone could feel it. Control was slipping. The questions weren't about justice. They were bait. and Crockett knew it. She didn't shout. She didn't break. She answered direct, firm, and without apology. And then it happened. Congresswoman Crockett, Barrett said, voice sharp, final. This is your last interruption. If you speak again out of turn, I will hold you in contempt. Jasmine's lawyer touched her arm, a silent plea to stop, but she shook it off gently. I was raised to speak when something isn't right, she said. Not when it's convenient. Not when it's allowed, when it matters. Silence. Barrett didn't hesitate. This court finds the witness in contempt, she said. Remove her. The gallery gasped. Reporters scrambled. Cameras clicked. You're serious? Jasmine asked, rising slowly. You've repeatedly disrespected the authority of this court, Barrett answered. No, Jasmine replied. I've disrespected the abuse of it. Then she looked directly at Barrett, eyes calm, not angry, just certain. You'll regret this. Not as a threat, as a promise. The bailiffs moved in. She didn't resist. She walked out head high. The storm, it turned out, was just beginning. And outside, the world was already watching it unfold in real time. Because you can try to silence a voice, but the moment you make that voice visible, you don't bury the message, you amplify it. You don't bury the message, you amplify it. And by the time Jasmine Crockett was escorted out of that courtroom, her image had already gone global. The flash of camera bulbs as she walked up, right, defiant. The soundbite, you'll regret this. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was prophecy. Social media didn't need context. It needed clarity. And the footage delivered it. Within hours, hashtag let her speak and hashtag contempt of silence were trending across platforms. Clips of Jasmine's final words were edited into montages set to cinematic music, shared by influencers, activists, even a few cautiously sympathetic lawmakers. Some called her a hero. Others called her a troublemaker. But all agreed on one thing: something had just shifted. Inside the courthouse, however, the mood was less triumphant. Jasmine had been formally booked for contempt, booked, fingerprinted, and held. Her legal team was scrambling. The charge itself was thin, procedurally questionable at best, but symbolically explosive. A sitting member of Congress, silenced and removed mid-hearing by a sitting Supreme Court justice? It was unprecedented and dangerous. This wasn't about courtroom conduct, her attorney muttered under his breath. Pacing the holding room, this was about power, and she flexed it. Jasmine sat still, wrists resting on the cold metal table, calm, collected, but not unaffected. She bent the rules to break me, Jasmine said softly. But she forgot something. Her lawyer paused. I don't bend. Outside, the backlash was building. Legal scholars were already speaking out. Former federal judges questioned the constitutional implications of Barrett's involvement. Editorials flooded the internet. One headline read, "Is Justice Barrett crossing a constitutional line?" But the real turning point came not from a pundit, not from a politician, but from a leak. Late that night, an uncut video of the courtroom exchange appeared online, an extended recording, captured and anonymously submitted by a court stenographer. No edits, no media filters, just raw footage. Jasmine's voice, her tone, her composure, and most importantly, Barrett's decision to hold her in contempt, without cause. The video went viral in less than 8 hours. Millions of views. Comments from law students, civil rights attorneys, and everyday citizens flooded in. She didn't disrupt. She spoke. This isn't order. It's oppression. Barrett didn't lose control of the courtroom. She lost the moral high ground. By sunrise, the damage was undeniable. The Department of Justice issued a brief but chilling statement. We are aware of recent proceedings involving Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and will be reviewing the conduct and judicial handling of the matter. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jasmine was released on her own recognizance just after 7 a.m. Her attorney met her at the exit. They overplayed it, he said. Jasmine smirked, exhausted but resolute. Then let's make sure that matters. That same afternoon, her team filed an emergency motion to vacate the contempt charge, not just on technical grounds, but as a direct challenge to the integrity of the proceeding itself. The motion didn't dance around it. This is not about courtroom order. This is about silencing dissent, about leveraging judicial authority to suppress a voice that would not conform, about intimidation disguised as procedure. But even that wasn't the full strike. Alongside the motion came a formal petition for Justice Barrett to recuse herself from the case, citing clear bias, overreach, and a conflict of interest. Legal experts called the move bold. Her critics called it necessary. Inside the Supreme Court, the silence from Barrett's chambers was deafening. No comment, no rebuttal, but whispers were already circling. Law clerks uneasy, senior staff questioning the optics. And within the judiciary, an uncomfortable reality was setting in. Barrett had turned a courtroom into a political weapon, and now she was the one under review. Meanwhile, the public reaction reached a fever pitch. The footage of Jasmine's removal became a symbol, not just of injustice, but of resistance. Protesters began gathering outside the courthouse. Signs read, "Let her speak power, fears truth. Courtrooms aren't cages." This wasn't a scandal anymore. It was a movement. And Jasmine Crockett? She hadn't said a word since her release? Not on social media, not on camera, not even a quote to the press. It wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. Behind the scenes, her legal team worked nonstop assembling experts, mapping timelines, preparing for the next wave. This wasn't just about winning back her name. It was about exposing the entire mechanism that tried to erase it. Cable news devoted full primetime segments to the unfolding story. Some anchors leaned in with skepticism, others with reverence. But one thing was clear, no one could ignore it anymore. Because this wasn't just Jasmine's fight. This was a test. Can a voice of dissent survive a system designed to suppress it? And by the end of day 2, a quiet consensus began to form across party lines, legal communities, and public forums alike. Barrett hadn't just overreached. She may have just awakened something she couldn't control. Barrett hadn't just overreached. She may have just awakened something she couldn't control. Because by day 3, it was no longer about one woman removed from a courtroom. It was about every voice that had ever been told to sit down, shut up, or speak only when spoken to. Jasmine Crockett had become something bigger than a witness. She had become a mirror reflecting a system that recoiled when challenged. And the reflection wasn't flattering. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had doubled. Protesters, supporters, law students, legal observers. No single group, no single ideology. Just people. People with handmade signs and tired eyes. People who weren't asking for theatrics, just fairness. Inside, the pressure was boiling. The courtroom was quieter now, more guarded. Even the guards stood a little taller, as if shielding the institution from the outside energy pressing against its walls. The air carried the weight of something unsaid. Everyone knew this wasn't a normal hearing anymore. Jasmine walked in with calm purpose. No entourage, no pretense, just presence. Her heels clicked across the floor like a metronome counting down to reckoning. She wasn't here for vengeance. She was here for clarity. And for everyone watching, that was already more powerful than 1,000 raised voices. Justice Barrett entered moments later. Robed, composed, but different. Not visibly shaken, she would never allow that. But her movements were tighter, her gaze more clinical. She didn't look at Jasmine. Not once. "This court is prepared to resume testimony," she announced. "The witness will take the stand. No mention of the contempt charge. No acknowledgement of the backlash. Just a return to order and attempt to reassert control." But the courtroom had changed. And so had the stakes. The prosecutor stood. "Let's return to the issue of public trust," he began. "Congresswoman Crockett, you've publicly questioned the impartiality of the judicial system. In your own words, you said, 'There are people in power who hide behind procedure when they feel threatened by truth.' Were you referring to this court?" Jasmine didn't flinch. "No," she replied. "But it seems like it applies." A low rustle moved through the gallery. No gasps. Just recognition. Barrett's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. The prosecutor pressed on, now more visibly agitated. "Would you agree that your combative tone, your evasiveness, and your willingness to undermine this court show a blatant disregard for due process?" Jasmine leaned forward, calm but unwavering. "What I refuse," she said, "is to sit here and pretend that what's happening is justice. This isn't due process. It's damage control." That was it. Barrett's gavel came down. "That's enough," she said coldly. But Jasmine didn't stop, not with volume, but with clarity. "With all respect," she said, turning toward the judge, "while we sit here being told when and how to speak, The world is watching. And they're learning exactly how the system treats voices it can't control. The courtroom fell into a silence that didn't ask for order. It demanded truth. Barrett's voice returned, now clipped with finality. Congresswoman Crockett, this is your last interruption. If you speak again out of turn, I will exercise my authority. I suggest you choose your next words carefully. Jasmine's attorney glanced toward her nervous, but she was already ready. I was raised to speak when something isn't right, she said, echoing her words from day one. Not when it's convenient, when it matters. The room didn't move. The judge stared, but the gavel didn't drop. Not this time, because something had shifted not just outside the courtroom, but within it. Not just public opinion, but institutional caution, because by now, the system knew if it silenced her again, it wouldn't just be making headlines. It would be writing its own indictment. Later that evening, as pundits analyzed Jasmine's words and Barrett's restraint, her legal team moved forward with the second strike, a formal motion to disqualify Justice Barrett from the case entirely. The language of the filing was pointed, meticulous, and damning. Justice Barrett's conduct demonstrates a loss of impartiality. Her previous rulings, statements during the hearing, and personal enforcement of disciplinary action indicate a conflict of interest and an abuse of judicial discretion. The motion cited judicial ethics standards, case law, historical precedent, but its power wasn't in its citations. It was in its subtext. Even the highest robes are not above reproach. By morning, quiet cracks in Barrett's image had begun to spread across the legal establishment, not from activists, not from political opponents, from within. Several prominent legal figures, former circuit judges, constitutional scholars, and deans of law schools, issued coordinated statements. One reads simply, "Contempt is not a weapon to enforce silence. It is a tool to maintain order. The moment it becomes personal, it becomes tyranny." Even former Barrett allies began to fall silent. Some issued vague statements of regret. Others refused to comment entirely. Inside the halls of the Supreme Court, aides whispered about pressure mounting behind closed doors. Barrett's silence, once a display of dignity, now felt like strategic retreat. Meanwhile, the country was still watching, still sharing, still reacting. Because this wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. It wasn't even just about Barrett. It was about every institution that claims to uphold justice, and what happens when justice is challenged not by riots, not by outrage, but by a calm voice that simply refuses to fold. The final line of Jasmine's disqualification motion said it best. This court was not used to uphold justice. It was used to punish speech. That cannot be allowed to stand. And now, as that motion circulated through federal channels, the question wasn't whether Barrett had gone too far. It was whether the system had the courage to admit it. Whether the system had the courage to admit it, that was the only question left. Because Jasmine Crockett had made her move. She stood firm, filed her motion, and walked away not as a witness, not even as a defendant, but as a symbol. A symbol of what happens when power is questioned by someone it was never built to serve. And now, the court system was staring at itself in the mirror, forced to answer a question it hadn't asked in decades. When justice overreaches, who holds it accountable? The response came faster than anyone expected. Just 2 days after Crockett's legal team submitted the motion to vacate the contempt charge and disqualify Barrett, a panel of senior federal judges convened behind closed doors. No cameras, no press, no speeches, just law, precedent, and pressure. At 11:42 a.m., the ruling was handed down. It wasn't just a technical victory, it was a legal earthquake. The contempt order issued against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is hereby vacated in full, the panel declared. The court finds no adequate legal foundation for her removal from the hearing. Her conduct does not meet the threshold for disruption. The action taken by the presiding judge undermines the principle of impartial adjudication. The words were cold, measured, devastating. Barrett had overstepped. The judiciary, the very branch she represented, had just confirmed it. The news hit the Capitol like a thunderclap. By midday, Jasmine's name was trending again, not for being dragged out of court, but for standing back up without apology. Reporters scrambled. Cable news networks cleared space. Legal scholars raced to dissect the ruling. Some called it historic. Others called it inevitable. and a few, more quietly, called it a warning to the highest bench in the land. In front of the courthouse, Jasmine didn't speak to the cameras. She didn't need to. She simply walked down the steps, papers in hand, chin high. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She carried the weight of vindication like a torch, not to burn down the system, but to remind it what justice was supposed to look like. But while the public celebrated, the fallout behind the scenes was just beginning. Because now, it wasn't just a matter of legal error, it was a matter of judicial integrity. Lawmakers from both parties began whispering, some more vocal than others. A letter circulated through the Senate Judiciary Committee requesting an internal review into Justice Barrett's decision to preside over a politically sensitive case with no clear jurisdictional basis. The subtext wasn't hard to read. How did this even happen? Barrett's long-standing reputation for composure and careful restraint was suddenly under siege. Her decisions were being re-examined. Her silence, once seen as stoic, now felt like avoidance. Meanwhile, conservative think tanks that had once rallied behind her appointment offered no defense. Liberal commentators pushed harder. Law school professors published essays overnight. Contempt was never meant to be used as a silencer, one article read. When a judge makes it personal, they compromise the robe. And then came the interviews. Former federal judges, ethics professors, former Scottish clerks all going on record, not just about the case, but about the bigger question. Should a sitting Supreme Court justice ever be allowed to oversee politically charged proceedings at all? That wasn't procedural critique. That was a challenge to the architecture of the judiciary. And Justice Barrett? She remained silent. No statements, no reappearance, no press conference. For the first time since her appointment, Barrett had vanished from the public spotlight, not by choice, but by necessity. Legal insiders speculated she was being advised to ride out the storm. But the truth was more unsettling. This wasn't a storm. It was a realignment. Inside the legal system, Crockett's case had begun to evolve. It was no longer a courtroom spectacle. It was a precedent. It was an example. It was being studied, cited, and debated in law schools across the country as a new threshold for judicial overreach. But outside those halls, in community centers and universities, on cable news and TikTok feeds, the impact was more emotional. People who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before were suddenly quoting her. "I didn't break the law. I refused to break. They wanted my silence. I gave them the truth." It wasn't just rhetoric. It was resonance. Because for once, someone had challenged the system from inside the room without yelling, without walking out, without folding. And she had survived it, not unscathed, but unbroken. The movement that had started with a subpoena was now a full-fledged public reckoning. Hashtags gave way to organized panels. Civil rights attorneys began building a coalition to advocate for stricter judicial oversight in politically charged cases. And Jasmine? She still hadn't celebrated. Instead, she returned to her roots, a small community center, the one where she'd once worked as a public defender. No stage, no teleprompters, just folding chairs and fluorescent lights. There, she addressed a crowd of students, activists, and local residents. This wasn't about a courtroom gavel, she said. It was about who's allowed to speak without being punished for it. "I stood up," she continued, "because I knew silence would cost me more." The room was still. "They tried to make an example out of me," she said, voice low but strong. "Instead, I became proof." By the end of the night, that clip alone had been viewed over 3 million times. And somewhere in the nation's capital, a system that had always assumed it could control, the narrative began to realize it had created something it couldn't contain. A system that had always assumed it could control the narrative began to realize it had created something it couldn't contain. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to fight the system from the outside. She cracked it open from within. The contempt charge that was meant to silence her became a megaphone. The courtroom, meant to break her resolve, became the stage where her truth echoed across the nation. And now, with the legal victory secured and the public watching closely, the question shifted again. Not was she right, because the ruling answered that, but what happens next? Because Jasmine wasn't finished. The judiciary had ruled in her favor, but Justice Amy Coney Barrett had yet to be held accountable. The contempt order was gone, but the questions remained. Why had a Supreme Court justice presided over a politically charged hearing? Who authorized it? Why was Crockett targeted so publicly, so forcefully? And what would stop it from happening again? The system wanted to move on, but Jasmine wouldn't let it. Just a week after her name was cleared, she filed a formal petition with the Judicial Conference, the very body responsible for investigating misconduct by federal judges. It wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. The petition demanded a full ethics review of Justice Barrett's conduct, citing abuse of judicial discretion, personal bias, and systemic intimidation. It wasn't just a call for accountability. It was a challenge to the culture of judicial untouchability. And it landed like a hammer. By week's end, over 30 sitting members of Congress across racial, gender, and even partisan lines had signed a joint letter supporting the petition. It wasn't about political allegiance anymore. It was about the right to speak without fear of reprisal, even from the highest chambers of law. Meanwhile, the Judiciary Committee began closed-door deliberations on whether new ethical constraints should be placed on Supreme Court justices when engaging in lower federal matters. It was quiet, it was procedural, but make no mistake, it was also revolutionary. Inside law schools, Jasmine's case was now being taught, not as a controversy, but as a case study in institutional overreach and resistance to it. Professors dissected the transcripts. Students wrote papers. Legal journals published symposiums titled Contempt and Control, Speech, Power, and Judicial Boundaries. Outside the legal world, the cultural impact only deepened. TikTok creators, podcast hosts, civil rights organizations, and student protest groups had all found a central figure. They didn't know they needed a poised Black congresswoman who didn't yell, didn't storm out, didn't crumble. She simply stood her ground, and for millions, that was revolutionary enough. Even traditional media caught up. In one segment, a veteran anchor put it plainly, "You don't have to agree with Jasmine Crockett's politics to understand what happened here." A woman was silenced in court on camera for refusing to fold. And instead of collapsing, she responded with calm defiance. The court made her the example, but she rewrote the message. But Jasmine hadn't forgotten what started it all. A gavel, a robe, a warning. So she went back to the courthouse, but this time, not as a witness, not as a target, and certainly not as a defendant. She walked the steps alone. No entourage, no press secretary, just her. And when she stepped to the podium, rain tapping softly on the microphones, she spoke not in anger, not in vengeance, but with the same composed fire that had carried her through the storm. "This didn't start because I broke a rule," she said. "It started because I didn't break. This robe," she said, gesturing toward the courthouse behind her, "is supposed to represent impartiality. But when that robe tries to crush a voice, especially one that has fought to be heard, it stops being justice. It becomes control." She paused, let the weight land. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about me. It was about how this system responds when someone doesn't fold, when someone doesn't make themselves smaller to make others comfortable. And then came the line, the one that would anchor every highlight reel, every analysis, every share. They tried to make me regret telling the truth. But the only thing I regret is how many others still feel they can't. The crowd reporters, supporters, passers-by stood in silence. Not the kind of silence born from control, the kind born from respect. Jasmine stepped down, umbrella in hand. She walked away, slowly, not triumphant, but steady, like a woman who had endured the worst the system could throw at her, and then made it answer for it. And somewhere behind those marble walls, a different kind of silence took hold, not from the people, but from the institutions that had just been reminded of something they often forget. The law may wear the robe, but truth wears no uniform. By the end of that day, Justice Barrett had still issued no statement, but she didn't need to. The silence said it all. The judiciary had backed down. The public had stood up. And the message had landed not in a soundbite, not in a headline, but in the quiet realization that echoed across courtrooms, campuses, and Capitol Hill. You can try to silence a voice. But the moment you do, you prove why it had to be heard in the first place.